So something that's affected me for a really long time at this point is something called imposter syndrome. And imposter syndrome is actually something that I had never even heard of until I got into the field of software engineering after graduating from New York University. But it really didn't take long after graduating my computer science degree and going and working at my first job out of college as a software engineer to start developing feelings of having imposter syndrome. So for those of you who are not aware, imposter syndrome is basically a syndrome that makes you feel like any of your accolades or any of your achievements that you've reached in life aren't as a result of your skill or your talent, but it's really just more of like blind luck or something that you had no control over. And it's also pretty common with people who do have imposter syndrome that they sort of believe that it's really only a matter of time until someone finds out, like their employer, for example, that they are an imposter. And at which point they think that, they'll get fired or something horrible will happen and sort of their whole world will come crumbling down. So now that we actually understand what imposter syndrome is, I want to briefly go over how mine developed and then talk about the few things that I did to finally overcome imposter syndrome in the hopes that you can also. So like I said, I did a computer science degree at New York University, and unfortunately I was very bad at computer science. And I really could not do well on tests and I could not do well on the projects, but I definitely went to every single class and met with my teachers constantly in an attempt to do the absolute best I could. I studied really hard. I went to the library basically every single day trying to learn the material, but for whatever reason, when it came to the tests, when it came to the projects, I really just struggled a lot, and I had a lot of trouble retaining the information and learning the material. And so I think really this is sort of where my imposter syndrome started and sunk in, because I could not do any of the material in college. I had a lot of trouble. I had to go through things multiple times to actually learn that material. And it felt like any time that someone understood something, it took me at least twice the amount of time to actually understand the same thing as my classmate. And that really didn't do me any favors in terms of building my own confidence in my programming fundamentals and learning concepts in computer science. So fast forward a few years and I'm now out of college and I'm successfully graduated from my computer science degree. And luckily I made it through. Despite all the projects and all the homeworks and all the tests, I was actually able to get that degree. And now I'm out in the real world being a software engineer. So my first job coming out of college, I worked at a startup and I was a software engineer there doing full stack development. And it wasn't until 6 or 8 months later of being on the job that I actually was laid off. And I've actually made a video on this, so if you guys want to go check it out, you guys can feel free to click here or wherever and go watch that video now. But basically I got laid off after I think it was 8 months. And I remember feeling like, this is it. Yep, I'm an imposter. Someone finally found out and I don't know what I'm doing. I was the most junior person on the team. Everyone else had prior programming experience to that job. And so I felt like I needed help to do a lot of different things. And first thing I want to say is that that's actually really normal, especially when it's your first job, especially when you're very junior in the field. It's very, very normal to need help to do these things, especially if you come from a more, traditional background like a computer science degree. A lot of the things that you actually learn in school is theoretical versus a lot of things that you do on the job is practical, because I don't think you're going to build an app every single day in school the way that you might build an app on the job. And so as you can imagine, this definitely did not help contribute to my confidence in computer science or my confidence as a software engineer. And unfortunately, my imposter syndrome was really at an all-time high at this point. So going from struggling in school to struggling at a job and then being laid off, I really felt like I maybe didn't belong in this field. And that was really upsetting to say the least. So now let's start talking about a little bit happier of a thing. And that's how I started getting over imposter syndrome and how I feel a lot better about my skills and my abilities as a software engineer, and how you guys can feel the same way too, hopefully. And this really started from the first thing, which was just to understand that the way that media portrays software engineering and coding is really the furthest thing from accurate. And so it's really fun to watch a movie where someone eats 3.5 beers, sits down as a freshman at Harvard, and then creates Facebook and it's $1 billion company, but that's really not how it works. And so while that makes for a great movie, it doesn't really make for a great mentality of how a software engineer should operate and how productive a software engineer should be. I think this is also something that's extremely prevalent in the show Mr. Robot, which I happen to love until the later seasons. Let's just not talk about it. But basically, there's a show where this guy is a hacker, but he's also very casually just tech support at a company or an engineer. And he can just sort of casually hack anyone he wants, and he knows everything about the Linux command line and Linux and operating systems and kernels and literally anything you know about computers. He knows that he doesn't have to Google it. He obviously just has it in his head, because that's what all software engineers do, right? We just have all the information in our heads at all times, and we actually never open a web browser to learn anything. But obviously, again, this is not the case. This is not realistic, but it does make for great TV. And so I think once I started understanding and realizing that media is not actually accurately portraying how people code or develop applications or build websites, I felt a lot better about my abilities, because I started understanding that sort of the baseline for being a good engineer is not creating $1 billion company while you're buzzed off 3 beers in college. That's a good start. The second thing that I started doing to get over my imposter syndrome was I started looking at actual empirical evidence that pointed to the fact that I wasn't good at what I was doing. And luckily for me, there actually really was nothing there that I could sort of hold on to and grasp and say, this is why I'm not a good software engineer, or this is why I'm an imposter, and this is why I should feel bad about my abilities. And so I think asking yourself a tough question like that, as scary as it might seem, I think it really can sort of make you face your fears and realize that actually there really is nothing to be afraid of, or there is no reason to doubt your abilities. And even in the worst case, where maybe you come up with 1, 2, let's say 3 different things that you feel like are good evidence for why you're not a good software engineer or why you're an imposter, I feel like really you could turn that on its head. And now, instead of actually being worried about what the worst case scenario is, you sort of know what it is, and you could actually start working on taking steps towards fixing those different things. So maybe it's the fact that you actually aren't good at Java, for whatever reason, or you don't write good, clean code. Well, the good news is now you can work on that. You've addressed the problems that you have, and you can start working towards tackling them and becoming better at what you need to do to become a better engineer and not an imposter. And also, sort of a bonus point here related to the empirical evidence that you should be looking for is you should understand that not everyone knows everything in software engineering. And in fact, there's actually no one that knows everything. And so it's okay to have questions, and it's okay not to know everything. And it's okay to learn on the job, because that's actually part of the job. If you've been hired at a company, you've had to fool supposedly multiple people, chances are, during multiple rounds of interviews, on multiple phone calls, in person, about your abilities. And I think really what you should try and do instead is, instead of thinking that your one opinion is correct, sort of crowdsource the different opinions that you might have gotten. So if you sort of got 5 different interviews for a certain company to work there and you got hired, well, that's probably 5 people who, basically believe that you should be part of the company clearly and that you can contribute successfully. So don't lean too much on your own opinion, but think about other people's opinions. And I think in that case, it's probably pretty positive because you got the job. I think the final thing, and really the most important thing for me to get over imposter syndrome, was just the fact that I actually faced the scary question of what happens if it's true that I am an imposter. And in that case, what I realized is that I guess all that would really happen is that I would lose my job, right? And then I would have to, find another job and fool another company, if I am an imposter. And I guess joke's on you, that company or whoever might be firing me, because I've already been there. I wasn't fired, but I was laid off. And luckily for me, actually wasn't that bad. And I've talked in previous videos about how being laid off was actually sort of, in weirdly, the most backwards way, the best thing that's really happened to me in my career. And it's sort of given me a whole other suite of opportunities I wouldn't have had otherwise. And it really ended up being a great thing for me. And so for me specifically, I was very lucky, and I'm very fortunate that that was sort of the scenario for me. But it made me realize that the most horrible thing that could possibly happen if I am truly an imposter is that I would lose my job. And sort of when I took that idea and I further unraveled it and I, played that game of these what ifs, I realized that that's not that bad in the grand scheme of things. And I think it's important to realize that your job is a job, and as much as you love your job or you hate your job, it's a part of your life. It's not your whole life. And I think it's important to make that true. I think it's kind of sad often that when we think about people or when we talk about people, their first inclination is to say, I'm Kevin and I do this for a living. When in reality, I feel like there's so many different things that make up each of us and give us our own identity. And so I think it's important to look at it through that lens and understand that even if you aren't a good software engineer, that doesn't mean you're not a good person. That doesn't mean you're not interesting. That doesn't mean you don't have other talents. And so I think that there's this really great quote that's actually from Einstein that really hits home. And I think that this is really one of my favorite quotes because I think it's so true. And that quote is that everyone is a genius, but if you judge a fish by its ability to climb a tree, it will live its whole life believing that it is stupid. And I think that's true. And I think for whatever reason, if you're not a good software engineer, you don't like it, you're a genius just in something else. So guys, I'll leave you with that quote. I hope this was helpful. This is sort of how I was able to get over my imposter syndrome and hopefully how you guys can too. Again, the 3 things that I did to get over my imposter syndrome was I understood that media did not portray coding or software engineering accurately. I looked for empirical evidence instead of comparing my feelings to what I thought would make me an imposter. And I sort of faced the worst case scenario and asked myself, what would actually happen if I was an imposter? And I realized that in the grand scheme of things aren't that bad if that's true. So if you guys enjoyed this video and found it helpful, please be sure to leave the video a like and subscribe to the channel for more. I'll see you guys next time.
10 bad bitches in a match. Wrist on many rock, no diamonds on me nasty. When you working hard, then your money start expanding. Bitches wanna leave me like some candy. And them drugs come in handy.